Thank you for coming to this afternoon's session, Schoolhouse Commercialism, Marketing and Junk Food, Exploring Policy and Law. Our two presenters this afternoon will present for about 10 minutes apiece, and then we'll open it to questions, are Alex Molnar and Bill Koski. Alex Molnar is a professor of education policy and director of the Education Policy Studies Laboratory at Arizona State University. He has published numerous articles on social and educational policy and practice. For the past several years, he has studied about and written about commercial activities in the school and market-based school reforms, such as private school vouchers, charter schools, and for-profit schools. He has a bachelor's in history, political science, and education, 2 master's degrees, 1 in history, 1 in social welfare, a specialist certificate in education administration, and a PhD in urban education. So he's had a lot of experience with school. Bill Koski, who will be speaking second, is the Eric and Nancy Wright Professor of Clinical Education at Stanford Law School. At Stanford Law, he directs the Youth and Education Law Project, which is an in-house legal clinic devoted to ensuring that disadvantaged children and communities have access to equal educational opportunities. He holds a law degree from the University of Michigan Law School and a PhD from the Stanford School of Education. He has represented hundreds of youth and families in race discrimination, student discipline, and disability rights matters, and is currently co-counsel for major school finance reform litigation in California. As an education policy researcher, he has published articles on education equity and adequacy, accountability, and the politics of judicial decision-making. With that, I will turn it over to Alex Molnar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. School commercialism doesn't sound like a very high-toned subject for an education policy professor. And in fact, when I started looking at school commercialism, gee whiz, in the mid-1980s, people thought it was certain to be a career-ending move. Because who could possibly care about something as inconsequential or as frivolous as marketing to kids in schools? Well, I succeeded in not ending my career, and I have been studying school commercialism lo these many years. One of the reasons that Bill and I are on the same panel today is we collaborated on a brief, as Kevin mentioned, and it's something that we at the new National Education Policy Center plan to do more of, and that is bring together research and policy recommendations with statutory and policy frameworks, so that if people read what is known to researchers and understand the implications of what is known, then they can also have available to them what it would look like in policy and in law if you wanted to act on what is known in a constructive way. So this brief was, I think, the second of 4 briefs that we've now done that we call legislative briefs. And I would urge you to go to the new National Center website and take a look at the 4 that are there. We're hoping that this is something that we can do a great deal more of going forward. But now to the subject of commercialism. Just to place school commercialism in a context, let me suggest to you that one of the ways we might think about commercial activities in schools or commercialism in general is we might think about commercialism as the curriculum of our culture. It is ubiquitous, it has values, and it instructs. And essentially, the overriding message of commercialism, whether it's in school or out of school, is that consumption is good for you. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, consumption was still considered a disease. But at the turn of the 20th century, consumption was regarded as the most appropriate response to a terrorist attack. So it's come a long way. And the purpose of commercialism is not just to sell products and not just to sell a point of view, not just to sell products or services, but to sell the point of view that consumption and material acquisition is the way to happiness and progress. That you literally are what you consume. You are what you wear, you are what you drive, you are how you smell. And if you aren't consuming, there's something terribly, terribly wrong with you. Now, the people who do marketing and the products and services that they market, you'll notice, for those of you that are my age, you'll realize that there was a time when products and services were sold in a rather concrete way. They've become more and more abstract. So it's ideas, it's lifestyle, it's experiences. You know, it's an erotic experience to take a shower if you look at shampoo commercials. You know, you walk past the deli and you get aroused. If you have a certain hair care product, which obviously doesn't reach me very well these days, or if you have a deodorant, you will be loved by whomever it is you want to be loved by. And if you drive a particular brand of car, you do it because it announces that you damn well deserve it. I mean, you are one tough puppy, loving puppy, cool puppy, whatever kind of puppy you want to be, that's what you are. Now, to some degree, this is kind of fun, but when you look at the history of marketing, what you realize is that marketing is another word in many respects for propaganda. And propaganda is a means of social control. And in fact, one of the leading early theorists of marketing, a guy named Edward Bernays, who was related to Sigmund Freud, both on his mother's and his father's side, which is pretty intensely related, was very explicit about the role of marketing in a democratic society, which is basically, once you've removed the noble class, once you've removed kings and queens, once you've got a mass democracy, there is the question of how you control. And one of the ways you control, and the way you control perhaps, is via propaganda. And so marketing, in my judgment, has to be understood as not just commerce, but as propaganda. And one of the things that you may have noticed in the terms of the trajectory of our public discourse, our civic life, is the extent to which it has been overtaken by marketing metaphors. So our political parties are now referred to as brands. Will the president damage his brand by doing this? Will the Republican Party brand be damaged by that? So now our civic discourse is almost completely captured by the language, the metaphors, the assumptions, and to some considerable degree, the values that inhere in marketing. Well, in schools, and I've done an annual report on marketing to kids in schools. The 13th annual report is actually coming out in a couple of months. And it's called Integrated Kids. What it means, what the title means is that the newest thing is that children are completely now integrated into a marketing apparatus. There are very few marketing campaigns anymore that are single shot, one at a time affairs. They are fully integrated, multi-platform efforts to sway opinion and drive people toward a particular product or service. Schools are integrated into this, and children are integrated into this. Now, in schools, we have a particular problem when it comes to marketing, because we require children attend school, and we require them to attend school on the theory that what's happening in schools is overwhelmingly in their interest and in all of our common interests. When a private interest, such as a marketing firm or the firm that hires the marketing firm, attaches itself to the school, it necessarily undermines that public purpose and that public interest. And this is quite apart from the fact that the marketing activities themselves tend to be disruptive and distracting. They tend to trivialize, distort, and diminish the academic and civic purposes of schools. So there's that issue involved with marketing to children in schools, but there's also the issue of what children are. There's a reason why, as a society, we don't allow children to drive, why we don't allow them to drink, why we don't allow them to buy tobacco. It's because they're not considered adults. And we have a theory of adulthood that says that once a person is considered to be an adult under the law, we assume that they have certain abilities to make critical assessments that will result in good judgments for themselves as individuals and for us collectively as a society. Now, obviously, we've all met an adult or two who doesn't meet that standard, but that's our theory. Our theory is that adults are different than children, and they're different in some important respects. Well, that being the case, it's very difficult to understand a rationale for how childhood is benefited, or how any individual as child is benefited by being the object of marketing. Because marketing necessarily objectifies. It has to objectify people. It has to create artificial groupings that, if those of you, I'm dating myself now, but those of you that read The Lonely Crowd by Reisman, you know, you talk about crowds of people that aren't really actual groups. They're artificial groups. And so we have marketing groups now. We have people that drink Coke instead of Pepsi. We have people that wear this clothing instead of that clothing, and so on. And people who express their individuality by doing the same thing that everybody else does in that group. But they individually come to that decision because none of them magically, as they report on survey after survey, are in the least influenced by marketing. Well, I've come to the view that, and what you'll hear Bill talk a little bit about as well when he gets into the legal aspects of this, is that marketing in schools is inherently harmful to children. That there are psychological harms, that there are educational harms, that there are fiscal harms. It costs money to provide these public institutions as venues for special interests, which is what marketers definitely are. And that one of the things that I'm very, very interested in, as many people are now, is the degree to which the obesity epidemic in the United States, as an example, is amplified and promoted by the activities of marketers, and particularly marketers who direct at children, because marketing research has suggested that brand identification is essential early, because it's more potent when a person becomes identified with a brand early, and that brand identification will stay with a person over time, and people will be inclined to spend more money to keep getting their brand that they're identified with. So marketers have a very clear interest in getting children early. So what does that mean when it comes to foods with little or no nutritional value? A couple of things. One is, I can tell you that the greatest bulk, more than 2/3 of the marketing in schools, is marketing of foods of little or no nutritional value. More than 2/3 of it is. It's an enormous amount of money spent to get kids to think that it's cool to consume sugared soft drinks, snack foods, fast foods, and so on. And the apparatus of this marketing now, back to the title of this year's the 13th annual report on commercializing trends, is now seamless, so that there are marketing tie-ins with what is marketed in schools, what is marketed in fast food chains, what is marketed in movies, what is marketed in toy stores, what is on the internet, what is in text messages, what are in games developed for children to play, and so on. So that it's very, very difficult now to tell editorial content or even pedagogical content from marketing content. So that all content is in danger of becoming self-interested content in the sense of propagandizing for a particular product, service, or point of view. And I suspect that this is one of the reasons why our public debate is now so coarsened as to determining matters of fact and truth. We now live in a culture in which it's actually possible to have your own facts. It used to be said that, you're entitled to your opinion, but not your own facts. Well, in reality, people now consider themselves to be entitled to their own facts. And if you listen to political discourse, you see this. Now, this may seem far afield from marketing in schools, but in my view, it's not far afield at all, because the marketer's message in schools is exactly the message that supports and undergirds the values that are coarsening our civic discourse. They are: look away, be entertained, consume. Your choice is the most important choice. The individual matters more than the group in all circumstances. Choice is the highest civic value. And if I had to think about why is it so commonsensical to people that school choice would be a good public policy with regard to schools? Why is school choice so appealing? It's because we have a population that regards everything as a consumable product rather than a dynamic process of co-creation. So that if you have a population that says, I can go into it, for whom it makes sense, I can go into a grocery store and I can choose from 18 kinds of cereal, why can't I choose 18 different kinds of schools? And the alternative that are offered by these few throwbacks, some of whom are in this room with me, that say schools are about democracy, civic participation, and so on. Poor Ken Saltman must just be suffering every day. It's just not cool to talk the way you talk, Ken, because what you offer, what choice offers on its face is everybody wins. Everybody gets their choice. There really is a free lunch. There doesn't have to be any conflict. And what does Ken offer? Ken offers struggle. He offers struggle. He offers engagement. He offers getting in a room with people you don't particularly like, that have ideas that you think are sometimes stupid. And sometimes they win. And you want us to do that instead of just saying, I like these people. I choose them. I'm going to school with them, and I'm never going to talk to you. And not only that, I like Cheerios and not Fruit Loops. And so we're having Cheerios over here, and it's just that simple. So what I'm saying in kind of a frivolous way here in terms of the presentation of it is something that for me is deadly, deadly serious. Because I actually, God help me, I agree with Ken Saltman about the civic purpose of schools and civic engagement and about the necessity to struggle together to try and figure out where truth, justice lie and what a good life is. Okay? And I worry about the fact that we seem as a culture to be losing this. When I look at marketing to kids in schools, the values that I see being taught by the marketers in schools, that are welcomed into schools very often, are values that are harmful to children physically, in terms of their health, that are harmful to children educationally and academically, in terms of their ability to study serious subjects over time, that are important and difficult, and that are important to us all. And therefore, I also see harms to our civic culture. And so a great deal of what I'm interested in now, and this is the segue to you, Bill, is how do you get a lever to speak against this effectively? How do you provide parents who are concerned a way to say, stop, you can't do this anymore? How do you frame policy so that people's rights and wishes are respected, but at the same time our collective lives are not degraded by this relentless march of marketing, which in my view is the apotheosis of a market system. We don't produce things, we now produce marketing. And it is corrupting us all. This is the end stage, as far as I can tell. So I'm really looking to this man seated beside me to help me, and by extension all of us, find ways that we might effectively address what I see as one of the more profound issues in education policy right now. So, Bill?
Yeah, thanks for the burden. Well, first of all, I want to thank for the introduction. It was very kind, Jared, and also thanks for the opportunity to share part of your afternoon with us to talk about this subject. And I want to make a quick comment or share an anecdote that is apropos of Alex's comment on how when he started studying this in the mid-1980s, it was viewed as a potentially career-ending move for him. Well, when I was approached by Kevin to think about writing the model legislation for this policy brief, I had, in the back of my mind, known this was an issue and had been troubled by it for quite some time. And I was troubled by the fact of marketing to children and commercialism in our schools, but even more so I was troubled by the fact that nobody seemed to be paying attention to it. So I was pretty happy to jump on this opportunity, so I called Alex up, and he may not remember this conversation, but I'll refresh his recollection. We started talking about his study of this for a long period of time, and I shared an anecdote about this scientist who's been studying this thing called the Pacific Gyre. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there is a layer of plastic particles that's about this thin, and it's the size of Texas and getting bigger. And there's no way of cleaning it up. And there's a great fear that's going to start creating big dead zones out in the ocean, because that's what it's doing. It's killing off life in the ocean in the section where it exists. And so I said to Alex, you've been studying the Pacific Gyre of education. At some point, somebody is going to recognize, some media person is going to recognize what a problem this is, and you're going to get all kinds of media attention. Just as this lonely scientist at, I think, UC Santa Barbara has received much recent media attention because he's the only one that knows anything about this thing. So there we go, Alex.
I'm still waiting, but
Yeah.
thanks, Bill.
So in our brief, we've outlined the nature and the extent, to the extent we know the extent, of commercialism in schools. And it takes a number of different shapes and forms. And I encourage you to take a look at the brief if you want to see in real nuts and bolts ways that marketers get into our classrooms, and some of the things you're probably pretty familiar with, advertising at baseball stadiums and things like this in high schools. Maybe there are placards on buses, vending machines, those things. But there are other ways that are much more insidious. Fundraising, to me, is one of the big things. If you have these companies that will say, if you are able to sell this much of our product, we will give you this kind of a matching grant for your school or something like that. So take a look at the brief if you want to know what this marketing actually looks like. Alex outlined what we feel to be the harms that come from these marketing efforts by corporations. And those harms are, as Alex says, psychological and in some ways ethical harms. I would consider it to be an ethical harm. Health and physical well-being, harms to individual children and our public health. Educational harms, as Alex mentioned, and potentially fiscal harms, especially if the deal that schools are cutting, if we market your product in our school, you will give us money, especially if that deal turns out to be what it looks like, a bad deal, that the money you actually get doesn't in any way, shape, or form match the amount of time and energy that you put into marketing somebody else's materials. So the question that I want to ask in the few minutes that I have here, and I want to go a little bit beyond the brief that we produced, which was mainly focused on establishing a regulatory or legislative framework for dealing with marketing in the schools. I want to ask the question, can any of these harms be prevented or remedied through legal action? And if so, what should be the best, or what would be the most promising legal or policy strategy available to us to begin to combat commercialism in the schools? And by way of outline, I want to first take a bit of a turn off to the side of digression and dismiss an objection that some might hear from time to time regarding the regulation of marketing to children in schools, and that is corporations have their own free speech rights and they should get to do this. And then I'll talk about some potential litigation avenues, and this is where the boring technician comes into play. I mean, I'm just a lawyer hack at the end of the day, and this is the way I think. So you're going to get a little bit of technical detail there. And then finally, talk a little bit about some of the things we mentioned in our brief, some of the potential regulatory responses to this. So let's get rid of that distraction first. Efforts to regulate advertising largely, writ large, in the past have sometimes run afoul of First Amendment concerns. Yes, corporations are people, and yes, they have First Amendment free speech rights. And there is actually this doctrine that our Supreme Court in its wisdom has established called commercial free speech. And if government generally wants to get out there and regulate advertising, they have to balance it against the free speech rights of corporations. I guess the thinking from a philosophical perspective is that on the one hand, we want to protect the public somehow. And specifically in schools, we viewed schools as this sheltered place where children can learn to become good, civically engaged citizens, on the one hand, versus this idea that, in fact, the necessity of allowing commercial advertising to inform the public so that we can have a more robust free market economy. It strengthens the free market, essentially, to have commercial free speech. So that's why this doctrine exists in the first place. I will just say right now that, at least in the context of schools, if this ever gets raised, you can poo-poo it during your cocktail conversations, because guess what? Using commercial free speech as the doctrine to apply in this instance is incorrect. Why? Because public schools are public property. And the way that you would look at regulation on public property is through a different lens, and that is, to what extent have schools made themselves available to the outside world for free speech activities? And the answer is, to a very, very limited extent. This is not a public forum, in other words. A public forum where anybody, once the door is open, should be allowed to express their viewpoints, including corporations. That's just not true with schools. And so anybody who might make this objection, we can brush that aside. Okay, that digression aside, just in case anybody was going to stand up, somehow I doubt it in this room, but somebody might have stood up and said, what about the rights of corporations? No, forget about it.
Oh, they're out there.
Yeah, you out there? Okay. So the next part of this then is, we've got these harms. Can we sue? What potential available remedies are out there in the absence of specific state regulation or statutes? Obviously, if a state has regulated the field, has already said this commercial activity is verboten in schools, this is permitted, but only in such and such ways. If any school district or school personnel run afoul of that, obviously we can sue there. But the question is, outside of those mechanisms on the books, what else can we do? And so I did what any good little plaintiff's lawyer might do. I ran through all the potential causes of action. Thought, is there any constitutional law here? No, not much. There's no constitutional right to be free from marketing in your schools, although I could twist some doctrine to get there. Not with the Roberts Court, though. But the question then becomes, okay, what about personal injury? What about tort law? These are harms, and the way we've dealt with harms in the past, especially harms from private actors, is using the tort system, personal injury system. And so, back to my first year law classes, I remember we need to have a duty, we need to have a breach of that duty, we need to have injury, and we need to have causation. Here's the problem. At almost every step of the way, those links can be broken. And let me kind of outline a few of those. We could think about the fact that commercialism schools looks a heck of a lot like tobacco, and the way we looked at tobacco companies maybe 30, 40 years ago. The fact that they were causing this harm. And some entrepreneurial lawyers got out there and said, okay, how can we sue tobacco companies under these personal injury doctrines like negligence and such? It's a little trickier here, because if we look at, first of all, whether or not schools have a duty, we're not there yet. Because yes, it is possible to make a school have a duty to protect children. In fact, all the time we see that. If there are bullies or harassers out there and the school administration is put on notice, they need to protect children. This is, for those of you who are lawyers, this is under the Gebser type thinking. So a duty can be created on the part of the school. The problem is that duty has not been established with regard to commercial activities in schools at this point. Can we hold teachers responsible? Hold that. I'll get back to it. Breach of that duty. That means that there needs to be knowledge, there needs to be knowledge on the part of schools of this potential harm, but they let that harm occur. Okay, we might be able to get a breach, but again, that requires their having a duty in the first place. Then harm. What's the damage here? Well, we've outlined a few of them. The one that you can get your hands on the most potentially from a legal standpoint is the healthcare harms, childhood obesity specifically. And in fact, there is some nascent litigation out there right now that would go directly after McDonald's itself or the processed and fast foods producers out there in the world, saying that they are the proximate cause of the obesity epidemic. That's not far-fetched anymore. Seemed like it a few years ago, but especially in light of what we've seen with tobacco litigation, that's a possibility. It is a whole different thing, though, to say that somehow schools are responsible for that. Unless and until we can demonstrate that the harm is there, whether it's psychological, physical, whatever, and we can demonstrate causation. And here's where the tough thing is. How do you demonstrate causation here? Well, there's images of marketing everywhere in the world. How do we know it's the ones that came from the school? How do we know that those health harms weren't caused by something else that children are doing? Bottom line, for those who care about this subject, we need to do a lot more research in establishing the harm that comes from marketing to children in a pretty direct way. How that results in psychological, ethical, moral harms, how that results in educational harms, distraction from regular schooling, making their minds mud so that they can't think critically, what have you. We need more and better research in that regard. Then I'm going to hire you as an expert witness and we can think about bringing that case. But for now, it's not that good on its face. Okay, what about public health? Could we make this a lawsuit on behalf of state agencies, county agencies, whomever, saying that this has caused much damage to us in terms of our public health care system? Again, not far-fetched. Look at what the attorney generals did with regard to tobacco. They said this costs states so much money. We could say that the obesity epidemic is costing states so much money and that advertising in schools is part of that. Whether or not you actually get to file a lawsuit almost doesn't matter here because people like attorneys generals collectively have a lot of power. And for some of you who've recently followed the Craigslist example where the attorneys general basically got Craigslist to take down their adult services site because they were facilitating sex trafficking, essentially. Who knows whether or not they could have won a lawsuit? It doesn't matter, but the threat or the specter of that was enough. I view this as a real possibility, having public actors bring these kinds of cases. I'll just touch upon two more very briefly and then talk a little bit about what we propose in the brief. One other one is thinking about holding teachers themselves or administrators themselves responsible. I'm always a little bit loath to do something like this because it does take a village, and rarely is it the fault of one teacher, but occasionally it might be. So one could say we need to analogize to other professions where there is a code of conduct or a code of ethics in place, whether it's my code of conduct or an ethics that I need to live under with regard to conflicts of interest and the like, or perhaps doctors whose Hippocratic oath says, first do no harm, even though that's not exactly what the oath says, but it says something close to that. And we could think about establishing standards of practice for teaching. By the way, this goes way beyond just commercialism. You could think about professional standards of practice for teachers in a whole bunch of different areas that could encompass things like conflicts of interest. You know, whether or not they're bringing materials into the classroom might help them somehow, but in ways that conflict with their students. And then we could use that as a way of demonstrating that teachers had this ethical, professional duty to not have that conflict of interest, but in fact they do. We're not there yet, but I think it's something that should be thought about, especially for those who care about the further professionalization of teaching as a freestanding, self-regulating type institution. Last thing I'll mention, and this is a no-brainer, is in those rare instances where you might actually see wrongdoing for commercial activities, and I'm thinking mostly here about incentives that are essentially kickbacks for providing marketing. And again, this is not far-fetched. Some of you might recall the scandal that we had in some financial aid offices at colleges where they were essentially getting kickbacks for providing certain loan packages from certain loan sourcing companies. This could happen. Well, we can go directly after that. That's not a problem under current criminal law and the like. Same thing with certain kinds of conflict of interest laws if it's egregious enough. Bottom line, the upshot is, though, is that there's not really a lot available that we can get our hands on right now in terms of existing law to bring a freestanding litigation. And if I haven't bored you to tears, I'm about to really put you to sleep at this point, because beyond those technical things that are unavailable to us, we do think, and I do think, that there's a real opportunity to begin to establish things like duties of care and to begin to establish the harms by working through our political bodies, whether they be local school boards, but better yet, through state legislators who have plenary power over regulating our schools, obviously. And if we can get legislatures to do things like make a finding of fact, legislative fact, that this activity causes harm to children, that's a big deal, because that starts to give us that handle that we need. In fact, if you read the model legislation we prepared for the brief, we have legislative findings in there that include this stuff causes harm. God, I hope somebody adopts that language, because then we've got something to grab onto. And then, moreover, and more directly, we can begin to enforce the rules that legislatures themselves are implementing. The good news is this has already started. I'm sure in the states that you come from, you can probably point to one or two rules on the books right now that regulate advertising on buses, that regulate the sales of low nutrition foods in schools, that regulate other kinds of commercial activities. And what we did in the brief was basically said, okay, let's give some options to potential regulators out there. And we broke it down into three big categories: mandates, balancing tests or regulatory requirements, and then finally process-based regulations. And just very briefly, the mandates, when we talk about that, is these are the things that thou shalt not do. Thou shalt not have vending machines in schools. Thou shalt not market to kids during certain school hours or something like that. And this is appropriate where it's pretty clear that the harm outweighs any de minimis benefit to doing these kind of commercial activities. And we see this all over the place. California has very strong statutes with regard to fatty and low nutrition foods in schools. And schools, as far as I can tell, are complying. That's great. And I think that this is, again, a direction that can go, and pretty easy with regard to the foods issues. Then balancing tests. So, okay, we want to be a little bit concerned about local conditions and local autonomy and decision making. And maybe they know better for their students than what the state capital knows. Sacramento doesn't necessarily know what's going on in Yolo County. So maybe we should let school boards decide, but let's give them some parameters for decision making. Let's say, here are the harms that you need to balance against these benefits. Or better yet, there needs to be an affirmative showing that these harms have been minimized to the extent possible before allowing this activity. And we drafted legislation that would enact that. And interestingly enough, there's actually some legislation out there that does do that in a couple of states. And then finally, process-based regulations. Let's get the relevant stakeholders involved, let's get them in a room, and let's let them decide. They can use whatever criteria they want, or they can use the criteria that we've selected. But the important thing is here, we have the relevant people in the room making that decision. And that can be done at a pretty high level, whether it's a committee of teachers, administrators, parent group stakeholders, what have you, making the decision as to whether or not a certain contract is going to be entered into. It can be simply disclosure in public hearings. These decisions need to get made in the sunshine, not behind closed doors, which is a really big deal. Most of these do get made behind closed doors. Or finally, we could bring it down to the individual level and say there has to be disclosure and consent of parents. And we do see this. For instance, in Minnesota, you are unable to use computers in the classroom that have access to external websites unless you get specific permission from parents. And their thinking there is not only the kind of nonsense that can go on the web, but in addition to that, the marketing that goes on directly to kids through computers at schools. So I'm going to leave it at that. Last time we checked, I don't know what happened to this actually, but the legislature in Massachusetts was very interested in using our brief to push a piece of legislation it had. I'm not sure where that went, but our goal is to get out there and push the cookie on this a little bit. So take a look at our brief.